This is not a joke or clickbait. In post-war America, there really was a car company called Playboy, and it was not another experiment from Detroit's Big Three. On the contrary, the creators of Playboy wanted to change the American auto industry and put an end to Detroit's monopoly. And perhaps the most surprising part of this story is that all of it happened before Playboy magazine even existed, back when Hugh Hefner was still doing part-time work for student publications. But let's start from the beginning. During World War II, Detroit effectively stopped being the automotive capital of America and turned into a giant military factory. Nearly all of the city's automotive production capacity was redirected toward building tanks, military trucks, ammunition, aircraft, and other military equipment. And instead of slowing down Ford, GM, and Chrysler, the war actually gave the American auto industry enormous experience, money, and new production capabilities. By the end of the war, the American automobile industry had become rich, technologically advanced, and equipped with massive manufacturing capacity. Another major advantage for Detroit was the so-called pent-up demand. During the war, new civilian cars were barely being produced, and for years, Americans had little chance to buy new automobiles. At the same time, the U.S. economy kept growing, incomes were rising, and people were desperate for new cars. All of this, combined with cheap gasoline, accessible credit, and a new consumer culture, created an almost golden age for Detroit. It also pushed the American auto industry toward bigger, more powerful, and more luxurious cars. In a market full of wealthy buyers and massive demand, there was little reason to focus on small, inexpensive automobiles. In that environment, many people believed the golden age of the American car market would last forever. That was when dozens of small companies and startups began appearing, hoping to find a place alongside the giants of Detroit. Some of them decided to take a completely different approach and focus on compact, inexpensive cars for people who could not afford large and expensive automobiles. Playboy Motor Cars was one of those companies, but the ambitions of its three founders from Buffalo were serious. They fully intended to compete with Detroit because they believed they had found an untapped and very promising niche. The idea was not to build an ultra-cheap economy car for poor buyers, but a compact yet fully American automobile for the middle class, with all the features Americans expected at the time. It all began in 1946, when a man named Louis Horwitz owned a successful Packard dealership. Horwitz noticed a growing demand for small and economical cars. Most of the time, these vehicles were bought as a second car for the family and were usually driven by women. Women became Playboy's main target audience. The company believed American women wanted something more compact, stylish, and individual, while Detroit had almost nothing like that to offer at the time. However, Louis clearly understood that simply building a compact car aimed at women would not be enough. He also understood that it would take something extraordinary for people to even notice the car at all. Traditional advertising was not an option because competing with Detroit and its virtually unlimited advertising budgets was impossible. So Louis and his two friends, one an experienced mechanic and the other a former Pontiac engineer, decided their car needed some kind of unusual innovation that would make it stand out. Only then, they believed, could Playboy attract media attention and truly get noticed. And that innovation became the car's roof. Today, it is completely normal to see a car whose roof folds into several sections and disappears into the trunk at the press of a button. And not just soft tops, but hard tops as well. However, the very first retractable hardtop appeared all the way back in 1919, when a man named Ben Ellerbeck modified his personal Hudson in his own garage. Although the idea never went beyond the prototype stage at the time, it inspired other engineers to follow the same path. The first production car with such a design was the Peugeot Eclipse from 1931. And 10 years later, in 1941, a similar system appeared on the Chrysler Thunderbolt concept car. However, it never reached production. In America, retractable hardtops did not enter mass production until 1957, with the Ford Fairlane 500 Skyliner, and many sources still call it the first American car with such a feature. But in reality, Ford was second. The first was actually Playboy. The retractable hardtop was supposed to become the one feature that would make the small Playboy stand out from the enormous crowd of other cars, especially the machines coming out of Detroit. Charlie Thomas, a former Pontiac engineer and one of the co-founders of Playboy Motor Cars, developed the retractable roof mechanism for the company's first prototype. Unfortunately, the roof still had to be folded manually. But even in that form, Playboy already had something almost nobody else could offer. The first prototype also received a rear-mounted 20-horsepower, four-cylinder Continental engine. Early Playboy prototypes also experimented with automatic transmissions. Some sources even claim the car had a fully automatic gearbox, although it was most likely a semi-automatic transmission. The developers promised that the underpowered engine was only a temporary solution, and later Playboy models did indeed receive more powerful 40-horsepower engines. The design of the car followed the typical American styling of the era, just in a much smaller form. So much smaller, in fact, that compared to traditional American automobiles, the 3.6-meter-long Playboy looked absolutely tiny, especially with its equally tiny 13-inch wheels. The first prototype debuted in the spring of 1946 at the Statler Hotel in Buffalo. And at the time, hotel presentations were not unusual at all for small car companies. Unlike the giants of Detroit, Playboy had no massive advertising budgets, no dedicated showrooms, and no dealership networks where it could present a new car to the public. So for a small company, a hotel presentation was a relatively inexpensive but still fairly prestigious way to attract the attention of journalists and potential buyers. The Playboy prototype received a fairly positive reaction from the press. Of course, nobody called it the future of the American auto industry or spoke about a revolution. But many journalists noted that Playboy looked surprisingly proper and very much in line with the spirit of the era. The car looked like a real production automobile rather than a homemade project or another questionable ultra-cheap compact car. Most importantly, the retractable hardtop really did attract media attention, exactly as the creators of Playboy had hoped. Journalists also pointed out the car's unusual unibody construction, something rarely seen on American cars of that period. That reaction was enough for the three friends to announce that serial production would begin in 1947. They even revealed production targets of an extremely ambitious 100,000 cars per year. At the same time, the company began actively searching for investors. Playboy never managed to secure one large investor, although the founders were not relying too heavily on that outcome anyway. Instead, they tried to gradually raise capital through stock sales, smaller investors, and the publicity generated by the prototype presentation. In many ways, Playboy Motor Cars already operated very much like a modern startup. Meanwhile, the car itself was heavily revised. The rear engine layout was considered impractical because it was more associated with small European microcars, while Playboy still wanted to compete in a higher segment. The engine was moved to the front and replaced with a 40-horsepower Hercules flathead engine. Experiments with semi-automatic transmissions were abandoned, and the car received a conventional 3-speed manual gearbox instead. At the same time, the exterior design of the Playboy remained almost unchanged. The company promised a starting price of just $900, which equals roughly $11,500 today, and that really was cheap. For comparison, even a relatively compact Chevrolet Fleetmaster cost around $1,500, and that was without even mentioning more expensive Buicks or Lincolns, where prices could be 3 or even 4 times higher. Horowitz managed to raise part of the required investment and decided that even with limited funding, Playboy production could begin. Although, to be more accurate, it was really closer to small-scale assembly. Playboy tried in every possible way to present itself as a real automobile manufacturer and even attempted to sell its cars through dealership networks the company was trying to partner with. However, very few dealers agreed, because small manufacturers were always a major risk. It was far safer to keep selling familiar Detroit cars than to get involved with a small company that could disappear within a year. And along with it would disappear any questions of warranty support, spare parts, and servicing. Before long, Playboy's biggest marketing miscalculation also became obvious. It turned out that American women did not necessarily want tiny cars. American car culture was still strongly associated with large automobiles, comfort, status, and safety. As a result, middle-class women were perfectly satisfied with cars like the Chevrolet Fleetmaster. Even the idea of a second family car, something Playboy was heavily counting on, had not yet become a widespread phenomenon. At the same time, the price difference simply was not large enough to change the market. Most buyers thought about it quite logically. If you are already spending almost $1,000, why not pay a little more and buy a full-size Ford or Chevrolet instead? At the same time, Playboy itself was not some absurd automobile. On the contrary, it was actually a fairly decent and inexpensive car that in many ways identified the future niche of compact cars for women, or second-family vehicles far too early. But Playboy's real problem was that a company like this needed mass demand in order to grow. And that was exactly what Playboy never had. The company declared bankruptcy in 1951. In total, the factory managed to produce 97 production cars. One additional car was completed after the company had already gone bankrupt, and the original prototype also survived. That brings the total number of Playboy automobiles ever built to just 99 units. 43 of them are still known to exist today, and 5 belong to David Kaplan, the grandson of one of the company's founders. He also owns the original prototype and personally restored it during the 1990s. By the early 1950s, the window of opportunity for small car manufacturers had completely closed. During the first post-war years, the shortage of automobiles made many people believe there was room in the industry for everyone, both the giants of Detroit and small startups. But once Ford, GM, and Chrysler returned to full-scale production and fully divided the market between themselves, there was no room left for small manufacturers at all. And the overall relaxed atmosphere inside Detroit's executive offices contributed to the American auto industry literally sleeping through the rapid rise of the Volkswagen Beetle in the United States. As for Hugh Hefner and his Future magazine, he definitely knew about the Playboy automobile brand and later admitted that he liked the name. However, the story that the magazine directly took its name from the car company has remained little more than a good legend, without any solid evidence behind it. Most likely, Hefner simply used a name that already existed, but by that point, had effectively become available again.